You fit the description. The words landed flat and final, like a stamp on a document no one else had read, and for a split second, even the overhead lights seemed to hum a little louder as Ava Johnson stopped mid-step under the flickering fluorescent panels of Gate C. Her sneaker sole still half an inch above the scuffed tile floor, her backpack strap pulled tight across her shoulder as if instinct alone told her not to move too fast, not to reach too quickly, not to give him any reason beyond the one he had already decided on. Officer Daniel Reeves stood 10 feet away, one hand resting near his belt, not tense, not rushed, just certain, his gaze fixed on her with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise its voice to control a room. And around them, the bus station shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways as conversations dimmed. A coffee cup paused halfway to someone's lips. A rolling suitcase slowed its rhythm against the cracked floor, because people always noticed when power chose a target, even if they pretended not to. Ava lowered her foot slowly, carefully, like the ground itself might react if she stepped wrong, her fingers brushing the edge of her worn hoodie pocket where her ID rested. Her heartbeat steady but louder than it should have been, echoing somewhere behind her ribs as she met his eyes, not defiant, not submissive, just present, and for a brief moment, something in Reeves' expression flickered, not doubt, not yet, but recognition of a moment he had stepped into before, one where the outcome was already written if he followed the same script. Set your bag down, he added, voice even, controlled, as if reading from a line he had rehearsed 100 times, and Ava obeyed without a word, easing the backpack off her shoulder and placing it gently on the floor, the zipper catching the light for just a second before settling into stillness, her movements deliberate, almost careful enough to feel like respect, though it wasn't meant for him. It was meant for the situation, for the thin line she knew she was walking. Somewhere behind Reeves, a security camera blinked red, its small lens angled down the corridor, unnoticed by most, but not by him, his body shifting half an inch to the side, just enough to change the angle, just enough to place himself between the lens and the bag on the ground. A movement so subtle it could have been nothing, except it wasn't, and Ava saw it. Not fully, not with certainty, but enough to feel the air change, enough to sense that this moment wasn't about suspicion, it was about something already decided. Where are you headed? He asked, though the question didn't sound like curiosity. It sounded like confirmation, like he was filling in blanks on a form no one else could see. And Ava reached slowly into her pocket, pulling out her ID with 2 fingers, holding it up before stepping forward just enough to hand it over, her voice quiet but clear when she spoke. I have a scholarship exam this morning. And for the first time, Reeves paused, not long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for the silence to stretch half a breath too far, his eyes flicking down to the name, Ava Johnson, then back up to her face, measuring something, recalculating, and then, just as quickly, the moment closed, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he took the ID and nodded once, like the detail changed nothing, like whatever he had already decided still stood untouched. Open the bag, he said, and the words carried a weight that didn't belong to the sentence itself, but to everything behind it, everything leading up to it, everything about to follow. And Ava crouched slowly, her knees bending against the cold tile, her fingers finding the zipper, the small metal tab cool against her skin as she hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something quieter, like the recognition of a line being crossed not by her, but by the moment itself. And as the zipper began to slide open, the sound cut through the silence sharper than it should have, a thin metallic whisper that seemed to echo down the corridor. And somewhere in that sound, in that stillness, in the way Reeves stood watching, without blinking, the truth of the moment settled into place, not spoken, not confirmed, but felt, like a shift in the air before a storm that no one could stop once it had already begun. The zipper stopped halfway, caught on a loose thread near the seam, and Ava's fingers paused there for a fraction longer than necessary, as if even the smallest resistance deserved patience. Then she adjusted her grip and pulled again, slower this time, until the bag opened fully and the contents settled into view under the harsh white light. A stack of neatly organized folders, a pencil case with a cracked plastic lid, a water bottle with condensation still clinging to its sides, and on top, a thin envelope stamped with the logo of a state scholarship program, its edges slightly worn from being handled too often, too carefully, like something that mattered more than it should have needed to. Officer Reeves crouched just enough to look inside, without lowering himself completely, his posture controlled, deliberate, as though even the act of bending had to remain authoritative, his eyes scanning each item not with curiosity, but with expectation, like he was searching for something he already believed was there. And when he did not immediately find it, his gaze narrowed. Almost imperceptibly, not confusion, not surprise, just a tightening, a recalibration. "Take everything out," he said, and his tone remained level. But the words pressed heavier this time, and Ava nodded once, her movements steady as she began placing each item on the floor beside her bag, aligning them unconsciously into a small, careful row, the folders first, then the pencil case, then the envelope, each placement precise, controlled, as if order itself might keep the moment from unraveling. Further, the station air felt colder now, or maybe it was just the stillness settling deeper, because no one had resumed their conversations, no one had moved away, they were watching without looking, listening without speaking, the kind of silence that did not belong to a place meant for movement. Reeves shifted slightly again, his body angling just enough to block part of the view from the camera behind him. And this time Ava noticed it more clearly, the subtle step, the quiet repositioning. Not accidental, not random, and something inside her chest tightened, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when a moment begins to feel less like procedure and more like performance. "What is that?" he asked suddenly, pointing toward the side pocket of the bag, one that Ava had not opened yet, and she followed his gaze, her brow knitting slightly as she reached for the zipper, smaller than the main compartment. Its metal tab warm from the overhead lights, and as she pulled it open, a faint rustling sound followed, softer than the others, like paper brushing against fabric. She reached inside and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in clear plastic, and for a second, her hand froze midair, her eyes flicking from the object to Reeves and back again, confusion settling in before anything else could take its place, because she had never seen it before, never packed it, never even imagined it being there. And yet it rested in her palm now, real, undeniable. Reeves stood up straighter immediately, his reaction quick but controlled, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. His voice firm, when he spoke, set it down. And Ava obeyed, placing the bundle gently on the tile beside her other belongings, her fingers lingering for a fraction too long before pulling back, as if trying to understand something that refused to make sense. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a pale reflection across the plastic wrapping. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, the silence stretching again, heavier this time, filled with something unspoken but deeply felt. Ava looked up at Reeves, her expression no longer just calm but searching, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. "That is not mine." And the words were not defensive, not raised, just stated, like a fact she believed would be enough. Like truth itself should carry weight in a moment like this. Reeves did not respond right away, his eyes fixed on the bundle, then shifting to her face, measuring, calculating, and for the briefest second, something flickered behind his gaze, something that could have been hesitation if it lasted longer, but it did not. It vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by something firmer, something decided. "We will sort that out," he said, and the phrasing felt deliberate, distant, like the outcome had already been placed somewhere beyond this moment, beyond her control. And as he reached for his radio, his movements precise, practiced, Ava's eyes drifted past him, just for a second, toward the blinking red light of the camera down the corridor, partially obscured but still there, still recording, still present. And in that quiet glance, something inside her shifted, not fear, not panic, but a realization settling in, slow and steady, that this moment was no longer just about what was in her bag. It was about something larger, something already in motion long before she stepped under those lights, and whatever came next would not be decided by what she said, but by what had already been done. The radio crackled softly in Officer Reeves' hand, a low static that seemed louder than it should have been in the still air, and for a moment he did not speak into it, just held it there, thumb resting against the button as if deciding whether this next step was routine or something else entirely. Then finally, he pressed down, and his voice came through calm and controlled, requesting backup in a tone that carried no urgency, only certainty. And that certainty settled over the space heavier than any raised voice could have. Ava remained crouched on the floor, her belongings arranged beside her in that careful line, the plastic-wrapped bundle sitting just inches away from her knee like an object that did not belong to the rest of the scene. Her eyes fixed on it for a second longer before she lifted her gaze again, not toward Reeves this time, but past him, toward the open space of the station where people stood frozen in half-decisions, unsure whether to stay or leave, their faces carrying that quiet tension of witnessing something they did not fully understand but could not ignore. A man near the vending machines shifted his weight. A woman adjusted the strap of her purse, small movements that filled the silence without breaking it. And somewhere above, the fluorescent light flickered again, casting a brief shadow across the floor that moved over Ava's hands and disappeared just as quickly. "Stand up," Reeves said. And this time there was a slight edge to it. Not sharp, not aggressive, but firmer, as if the moment required a change in position, and Ava rose slowly, brushing her palms lightly against her jeans, the fabric rough against her skin grounding her in a way nothing else could. Her backpack still open on the floor behind her, its contents exposed under the harsh lighting like evidence in a display she never agreed to. Reeves stepped closer now, closing the distance by a few feet, his presence more immediate, more imposing, though his expression remained composed, his eyes scanning her face again, searching for something that would confirm what he had already decided, but finding only that same steady calm, that same quiet presence that did not match the narrative unfolding around them. "You said you are heading to an exam," he continued, his tone almost conversational now, as if layering normalcy over the situation could make it easier to control, and Ava nodded once, her voice steady when she answered, "Yes, sir." The word respectful but not submissive, simply part of how she spoke, part of how she had been taught to navigate moments exactly like this. Reeves glanced briefly at the envelope on the floor, the scholarship logo catching his attention again, and for a second his jaw tightened, a subtle reaction that passed quickly but did not go unnoticed by Ava, who followed his gaze and then returned it to his face, reading the shift even if she did not yet understand its full meaning. In the distance, the faint sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, measured and rhythmic, backup responding, and with that sound came a shift in the atmosphere, a quiet escalation that did not need words to announce itself. Ava's eyes flicked once more toward the partially obscured camera, its red lights still blinking steadily. And this time she held her gaze there a fraction longer, not in hope, not in expectation, but in acknowledgement, as if recognizing that somewhere beyond this moment, beyond this controlled space, something was being recorded that could not be undone. "Do you understand what is happening here?" Reeves asked, his voice lower now, closer, and the question hung in the air between them, not as an invitation for explanation, but as a test, and Ava met his eyes directly when she answered, her tone quiet but unwavering. "Yes, sir, I do." And for the first time, there was something different beneath her calm, not fear, not anger, but clarity. A recognition settling into place that this situation was not about discovery. It was about confirmation, not about truth, but about proving something already decided. Reeves held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, and in that moment, something almost imperceptible passed across his expression, a flicker that could have been doubt if it had been allowed to grow, but it did not. It tightened instead, reshaping into something more rigid, more resolved, as if whatever hesitation existed had been pushed aside by something stronger, something deeper rooted. The footsteps grew louder now, 2 additional officers appearing at the far end of the corridor, their presence immediate but controlled, their eyes taking in the scene quickly, the open bag, the items on the floor, the small bundle, and Ava standing there between it all. And as they approached, the space seemed to close in further, the circle tightening without anyone physically moving closer. The moment becoming something larger than a simple stop, something that carried weight beyond the walls of the station. Ava took a slow breath, the kind that filled her chest fully before releasing, and as she did, Her gaze shifted once more, briefly, toward the line of her belongings on the floor, the envelope, the pencil case, the water bottle, small ordinary things that now felt distant from her, like they belonged to a different version of this moment, one that had already passed. And when she looked back up again, her posture remained straight, her expression composed, but something inside her had settled, something quiet and unshakable, like a decision made without words. And in that stillness, as the officers came to stand beside Reeves and the air grew heavier with unspoken conclusions, the truth of the moment remained exactly where it had been from the start, not in the object on the floor, not in the accusations forming around her, but somewhere else entirely, waiting, unseen but present, like the steady red light blinking down the corridor, recording everything without interruption. The two officers who approached did not rush, their steps measured, their posture neutral in a way that suggested routine, but their eyes moved quickly, taking in details, the open bag, the items lined on the floor, the small plastic bundle resting apart from everything else, and finally Ava, standing still with her shoulders relaxed but her spine straight, her hands at her sides, not clenched, not raised, simply present. One of them, a taller man with a calm expression and a badge that caught the light briefly, glanced at Reeves before speaking, his voice low. "What have we got?" And Reeves did not look at him immediately, his gaze still fixed forward as he answered. "Possible possession, found during a stop." The phrasing clean, practiced, as if it had been said many times before, and the second officer nodded once, stepping slightly to the side to get a clearer view of the items on the ground. Ava watched the exchange quietly, her eyes moving between them, noting the difference in tone, the difference in posture, the way one of the officers looked at the situation while the other seemed to look through it, already aligning himself with what had been said rather than what was actually there. "Is this yours?" the taller officer asked, his voice directed at Ava now, not accusing, not soft, just direct, and she shook her head gently, her answer steady. "No, sir, it is not." And the words hung in the air without resistance, without urgency, simply existing as truth offered without force. Reeves shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that placed him half a step forward, reclaiming the center of the interaction, his presence tightening the space again. "It was in her bag," he added, and the statement carried more weight than the question that came before it, because it framed the moment in a way that did not invite doubt. The taller officer crouched down, his hand hovering just above the plastic-wrapped bundle before he stopped, not touching it yet, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if considering something beyond the surface. And then he glanced up briefly, not at Ava, but at Reeves, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them, something small but present. Ava noticed that too, not fully understanding it, but recognizing that this moment was not as simple as it appeared, that there were layers moving beneath the surface, decisions being made in silence. The second officer stepped back half a pace, his gaze drifting momentarily toward the corridor behind them, and for just a second, his eyes landed on the security camera, the blinking red lights steady and indifferent, recording everything without judgment, and then he looked away, returning his attention to the scene as if that detail did not matter, as if it had not just quietly witnessed the entire exchange. "We are going to need you to come with us," Reeves said, his tone firm but even, and the words settled over the space like a conclusion that had already been reached, and Ava nodded once, not immediately moving, just acknowledging, her eyes lifting to meet his again, and in that moment, there was no fear in her expression, no visible resistance, only a quiet steadiness that did not match the situation unfolding around her. "Can I take my things?" she asked, her voice calm, and Reeves hesitated for the briefest second before nodding. "Leave the bag. We will handle it." And she complied, reaching down to gather only the envelope from the floor, her fingers brushing over its surface as she lifted it, holding it lightly against her chest, as if it grounded her, as if it reminded her of something beyond this moment, something that still existed outside of what was happening here. The taller officer rose, back to his feet, his expression unchanged, but his eyes lingered on Ava for a fraction longer than necessary, studying her, not with suspicion, but with something closer to consideration, as if weighing a question he had not yet asked. Reeves turned slightly, gesturing toward the hallway leading away from the main terminal, and Ava followed, her steps measured, each one echoing softly against the tile floor, the sound blending with the distant announcements overhead that now felt disconnected from everything happening in this space. As they walked, the distance between Ava and the camera grew, but the red light continued to blink steadily in the background, capturing the last seconds of the scene. The open bag still on the floor, the items left behind in that careful line, and the small plastic bundle resting where it had been placed, untouched, unchanged, yet carrying the weight of everything that had just unfolded. And as Ava disappeared down the hallway with the officers, her grip tightening slightly around the envelope, something within her remained unshaken, a quiet certainty that settled deeper with each step, not because she knew what would happen next, but because she understood something that could not be taken from her, something that existed beyond accusation, beyond assumption, something that did not need to be spoken to be true. And behind her, the station slowly resumed its movement, conversations picking up in fragments, footsteps continuing, but the space where she had stood remained marked by a silence that lingered just a little longer than the rest. The hallway they entered was narrower, quieter, the hum of the main terminal fading behind them with each step, replaced by the softer echo of footsteps and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights that flickered faintly above, casting long, pale reflections along the polished floor. And Ava walked between the officers without resistance, her pace steady, her breathing even. The envelope still held lightly against her chest as if it anchored her to something outside the walls closing in around her. Officer Reeves walked slightly ahead now, his shoulders squared, his stride consistent, not hurried, not hesitant, just controlled, as though this path had been taken many times before and required no thought, while the taller officer remained a step behind Ava, his presence less imposing but more observant, his eyes shifting occasionally, taking in details that did not belong to routine alone. They reached a set of double doors marked, authorized personnel only, and Reeves pushed one open without breaking stride, the hinge letting out a low creak that lingered in the otherwise quiet corridor. And as Ava stepped through, the air changed, cooler, more contained, carrying the faint scent of cleaning solution and something metallic that clung subtly to the space. Inside, the lighting was harsher, more direct, casting fewer shadows, leaving little room for anything to hide. And a row of empty chairs lined one wall, their plastic surfaces reflecting the overhead glare, untouched and used, like placeholders for moments exactly like this. "Have a seat," Reeves said, gesturing toward one of the chairs, and Ava complied, lowering herself slowly, placing the envelope in her lap, her hands resting over it, fingers interlaced lightly as she looked up, not at the floor, not away, but forward, meeting the space with the same quiet steadiness she had carried from the beginning. The taller officer remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze drifting toward a small monitor mounted high in the corner, its screen showing a grid of camera feeds, flickering images from different parts of the station, each frame silent, each moment captured without context. And among them, barely noticeable unless one looked closely, was the corridor they had just left, the open space, the scattered items, the bag still lying on the tile, and the blinking red light that had recorded everything from the start. "You said you have an exam." The taller officer spoke again, his voice softer now, less formal, and Ava nodded, her answer calm. "Yes, sir, in less than an hour." And for a brief moment, the weight of time entered the room, not loudly, not urgently, but present, like a clock ticking somewhere just out of sight. Reeves moved toward a desk at the far end, setting his radio down with a quiet click, then reaching for a clipboard, his movements precise, methodical, as if following a sequence that did not require deviation. And when he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, more procedural now. "We are going to ask you a few questions." And Ava listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, her eyes following him as he wrote something down, the sound of pen against paper faint but steady. "Where are you coming from this morning?" he asked, and she answered clearly, "From home, sir. I took the early bus," her voice carrying no hesitation, no uncertainty, just simple facts delivered without embellishment. Reeves nodded once, jotting something down, then continued, "And the bag you were carrying, that belongs to you." And Ava replied just as evenly, "Yes, sir, it does," her gaze unwavering, and the room held that answer for a second longer than necessary, as if weighing it against something unseen. The taller officer shifted slightly, stepping closer to the desk, his eyes moving from the clipboard to Reeves' face, watching, not interfering, but present in a way that suggested he was not fully aligned with the rhythm unfolding. Ava's attention drifted briefly again, not toward them this time, but toward the small monitor in the corner, the grid of silent images flickering in sequence, and though she could not see details clearly from where she sat, she knew what was there, knew what had been captured, and in that quiet recognition, something inside her settled further, not fear, not panic, but a grounded certainty that did not depend on what was being said in this room. Reeves flipped the page on the clipboard, the sound crisp in the stillness, and as he prepared to ask the next question, there was a moment, small and almost imperceptible, where his hand paused, just above the paper, as if something had interrupted the flow, something he had not expected to consider, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same controlled motion as before. Outside the room, the faint echo of voices carried through the hallway, distant and indistinct, reminders that the world beyond these walls continued uninterrupted, that time moved forward regardless of what happened here, and Ava sat in that space between moments, between what had been and what would come next, her hands resting lightly over the envelope, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady. And in the quiet, under the harsh lights and the watchful silence of unseen cameras, the truth remained exactly where it had always been, unchanged, waiting, patient, and unspoken. The pen in Officer Reeves' hand moved again, but slower now, each stroke pressing slightly harder into the paper, as if the act of writing required more effort than before, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around that sound alone, the faint scratch of ink against a printed form echoing louder than the hum of the lights above, while Ava remained still in her chair, her hands resting lightly over the envelope in her lap, her fingers no longer interlaced but relaxed, as if whatever tension had once been there had settled into something steadier, something quieter. The taller officer shifted his stance near the desk, his gaze lingering not on Ava, but on the clipboard in Reeves' hand, watching the way the notes were being written, the phrasing, the pauses, the subtle hesitations that did not belong to routine, and then his eyes flicked briefly toward the monitor again, the grid of camera feeds continuing its silent rotation, each frame unchanged yet holding more than it appeared. "You said the bag is yours," Reeves continued, his voice measured, and Ava nodded once, her answer consistent, "Yes, sir." And he followed with another question, "And you are saying the item found inside does not belong to you?" And again, her response did not shift, did not waver. "That is correct, sir." Her tone calm, almost gentle, as if she were stating something obvious rather than defending herself. The taller officer exhaled quietly through his nose, a subtle sound that might have gone unnoticed if the room had not been so still, and he took a step closer to the desk, placing one hand lightly on its edge, not interrupting, but present in a way that suggested the moment was no longer just procedural. "Where exactly did you board the bus?" Reeves asked, his pen hovering now rather than writing, and Ava answered without delay, "Downtown Terminal, Platform 3, and Reeves nodded. But this time he did not write immediately, his eyes lifting from the page to her face, holding there a second longer than before, as if searching for something beyond the answer itself. The silence that followed stretched, not uncomfortable, but dense, filled with something unspoken, something building beneath the surface, and Ava met his gaze without resistance, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, her presence grounded in a way that did not match the direction of the questioning. The taller officer finally spoke, his voice even. "There are cameras at that platform." And the statement hung in the air without accusation, without emphasis, just a fact placed into the room, and Reeves' pen stilled completely this time, his grip tightening just slightly before loosening again. A small movement that did not escape notice. "There are cameras everywhere," Reeves replied after a beat, his tone controlled, but the words carried a different weight now, less certain, more guarded, and Ava's eyes shifted briefly toward the monitor again. the faint flicker of images reflecting in her gaze before she looked back, not at Reeves, but somewhere just past him, as if her focus had moved beyond the immediate moment to something larger, something unfolding outside the room. "May I say something?" she asked quietly, her voice steady, and Reeves hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before nodding once. "Go ahead." And Ava drew a slow breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to center herself before she spoke. "I understand what this looks like, and I understand what you believe right now." Her words measured, careful, not defensive, not emotional, just precise. "But I also know what is true." And she paused there, not to create effect, but because there was nothing more that needed to be added. The room absorbed her words without reaction at first, the silence stretching again, heavier this time, and the taller officer glanced at Reeves, then back at Ava, his expression unchanged but his posture shifting slightly, as if the weight of the moment had moved from observation to consideration. Reeves looked down at the clipboard again, then back up, his jaw tightening just enough to show that something had shifted beneath his composed exterior. Something small but persistent, like a thought he could not fully dismiss. And as he turned the page, the sound of paper against paper felt louder than it should have, sharper, cutting through the stillness. Outside the room, footsteps passed by, voices murmured briefly, then faded again, the world continuing just beyond the walls, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside. And Ava sat there, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, but different in a way that could not be easily seen. Her calm no longer just composure, but clarity, something rooted deeper than the situation itself. The taller officer straightened slightly, his hand leaving the desk, and for the first time, he looked directly at Reeves with something more than routine acknowledgement, something that suggested a question forming, unspoken but present, and Reeves felt it, even if he did not look up immediately, even if he continued to hold the pen as though nothing had changed. Because in that room, under those lights, with the silent watch of unseen cameras and the quiet certainty of a girl who did not raise her voice, something had begun to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had once seemed solid. The silence that followed did not break. It deepened, settling into the room like something with weight, and Officer Reeves finally set the pen down, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a quiet placement against the clipboard that echoed louder than it should have, his fingers lingering there for a moment as if deciding whether to pick it back up again, while across from him Ava remained still, her gaze steady, not fixed on him now, but slightly to the side, as if she was listening to something. Beyond the immediate exchange, something quieter, something more certain. The taller officer shifted his stance again, this time stepping fully beside the desk rather than behind it, closing the subtle distance that had existed before, his presence now more aligned with the moment than with the procedure, and he looked down at the clipboard briefly, then back at Reeves, his voice calm, but carrying a different tone now. "What time did the call come in?" And the question was simple, but it did not belong to the script Reeves had been following. Reeves did not answer immediately, his jaw tightening slightly as his eyes flicked toward the monitor in the corner, then back to the desk. "Early this morning," he said, his tone controlled, but the answer lacked the precision that had defined his earlier responses, and the taller officer nodded once, not pressing yet, just acknowledging, but his gaze did not leave Reeves this time. Ava's fingers shifted slightly over the envelope in her lap, not gripping it tighter, not fidgeting, just adjusting, and the faint sound of paper against fabric filled the quiet space for a brief second before fading again, and she spoke, her voice low but clear. "What platform did the call say I was on?" And the question was not confrontational, not challenging, just direct, placed into the room with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning. Reeves looked at her then, fully, his expression unreadable at first, but something behind his eyes flickered, something that had not been there before, and for a moment, he did not respond, the silence stretching just long enough to be noticed. The taller officer turned his head slightly toward Ava, then back to Reeves, and there was a pause, a small but undeniable shift in the balance of the room, as if the direction of the moment had tilted just slightly off its original path. "We received information," Reeves said finally, his words measured, but the phrasing felt less solid now. less certain. And Ava nodded once, not interrupting, not reacting, just acknowledging the statement as it was given. Then she added quietly, "But I told you where I boarded." And the simplicity of the words seemed to press against the space more than anything louder could have. The monitor in the corner flickered again, the grid of camera feeds shifting frames, and the taller officer's eyes moved toward it almost instinctively, his attention catching on one of the screens for a fraction longer than the others. And though the image was small, indistinct from across the room, it was enough to register, enough to remind him of something he had already said, something now sitting unresolved in the air. Reeves followed his glance this time, just for a second, his eyes landing on the monitor before returning to the desk, but that second was enough. Enough for the room to feel different, enough for the certainty that had filled it earlier to loosen just slightly at the edges. Ava sat quietly through it, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, just that same quiet clarity, as if she understood something that did not need to be proven out loud, something that would reveal itself in time, whether anyone acknowledged it now or not. The taller officer straightened, his shoulders shifting as he drew a slow breath, and then he spoke again, his voice still calm, but firmer now. "We should review the footage." And the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, not because they were loud, but because they pointed somewhere specific, somewhere real, somewhere that existed outside of statements and assumptions. Reeves did not respond immediately, his hand moving back toward the pen, then stopping, hovering just above it, and for a moment, the room held its breath. The hum of the lights, the faint echo of distant footsteps, the quiet presence of three people standing at the edge of something shifting beneath them. Ava's eyes moved once more, briefly, toward the monitor, then back, and she said nothing, because she did not need to, because in that space, under that light, with the quiet insistence of truth beginning to surface, silence had already begun to speak for her. And as the moment stretched, not breaking but bending, something that had once seemed fixed started to move, slowly, quietly, but undeniably, like a story beginning to turn in a direction no one could fully control anymore. For a moment, no one moved, and the weight of the taller officer's words seemed to settle into every corner of the room, pressing gently but firmly against the silence until it could no longer be ignored. And Officer Reeves finally exhaled, slow and controlled, his hand lowering away from the pen as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than the surface of his expression. And he nodded once, not to Ava, not even fully to the other officer, but to the moment itself. "Pull it up," he said, his voice quieter now, less commanding, and the shift in tone did not go unnoticed, not by Ava, not by the man standing beside him. Because something had changed, subtle but undeniable. The taller officer stepped toward the wall-mounted monitor, his movements deliberate, his fingers reaching for the small control panel beneath it, pressing a sequence of buttons that caused the grid of camera feeds to flicker, shift, and then expand one frame larger than the others, the image sharpening. Just enough to reveal the corridor from earlier, the open space, the polished floor, the faint reflection of overhead lights stretching long and pale across the tiles. Ava's eyes lifted to the screen, not quickly, not urgently, just steadily, as if she had been expecting this moment from the beginning, and she watched without speaking as the footage began to rewind. The motion slightly stuttered, figures moving backward through time, steps retracing themselves, gestures undoing their own intent. Reeves remained where he stood, but his posture had changed, not visibly enough for someone outside the room to notice, but enough that the tension in his shoulders no longer felt like control, more like restraint, like something being held in place that was starting to slip. The taller officer adjusted the playback speed, slowing it, isolating the moment, and there it was, Ava stepping into frame, her backpack resting naturally on her shoulder, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, and then Reeves entering the scene, his approach calm, measured, everything appearing exactly as it had felt at the time, controlled, ordinary, until the angle shifted slightly, until the frame caught something smaller, something quieter. The camera from the opposite corner came into focus. And for the first time, the positioning became clear, the way Reeves had stepped, the way his body had turned, not randomly, not unconsciously, but with intention, placing himself just out of the primary line of sight, and Ava's gaze did not move from the screen now. Her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she were watching something she already understood. The footage continued, and then came the moment, small, almost invisible at full speed, but undeniable when slowed. Reeves' hand moving near the open edge of the bag, not abrupt, not obvious, just a brief motion. A placement so subtle it could have been missed entirely if not for the second angle capturing it from the side. The object appearing where there had been nothing seconds before, the sequence unfolding without sound, without commentary, just image following image in quiet, undeniable clarity. The room did not react immediately. No one spoke, no one moved, because the silence now carried something heavier than before, something final. And the taller officer's hand stilled on the control panel, his eyes fixed on the screen for a second longer before he slowly turned his head toward Reeves, not sharply, not accusingly, just enough to acknowledge what had been seen. Reeves did not look at him, not yet, his gaze still forward, but unfocused now, as if the image on the screen existed somewhere beyond his line of sight. His jaw tightening slightly, then releasing, then tightening again, a small, repetitive motion that spoke more than words could have in that moment. Ava remained seated, her hands still resting over the envelope, her posture unchanged, but something in the room had shifted around her, the weight that had once pressed toward her now redistributing, settling into a different space, a different direction, and she did not smile, did not speak, did not react outwardly, because there was nothing to add, nothing to prove, nothing to demand. The taller officer finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying no anger, no raised tone, just the quiet weight of acknowledgement. We need to pause this. And the words were not a question, not a suggestion, just a statement placed into the room like a line drawn clearly across what had been and what was now. Reeves blinked once, slowly, his eyes closing for just a fraction longer than necessary before opening again. And when he finally turned his head, it was not toward Ava, not toward the screen, but toward the floor, the polished tile reflecting the overhead lights in long, pale streaks that stretched out beneath him. And for the first time since the moment began, the control he had carried so effortlessly seemed to loosen, not dramatically, not visibly enough for an outside observer to name, but enough that the silence in the room no longer belonged to Ava, no longer held her in place, but had shifted entirely, settling now around him. And in that quiet, under the harsh white light and the steady gaze of recorded truth, something that had been carefully constructed began to unravel, not loudly, not suddenly, but with a slow, undeniable certainty that could not be stopped once it had begun. No one spoke after the footage stopped, and the absence of sound felt heavier than any accusation could have been, settling into the room with a quiet finality that did not need to be explained, because what had been seen could not be unseen, and what had been understood could not be undone. The monitor remained frozen on that single frame. Reeves' hand caught mid-motion near the edge of the bag, the angle clear, the context undeniable, and the fluorescent light above flickered once, briefly, illuminating the image with a cold sharpness before returning to its steady hum. The taller officer did not move immediately, his hand still resting near the control panel, his eyes fixed on the screen for a second longer before he slowly exhaled, the breath measured, controlled, but carrying something beneath it, not anger, not surprise, but recognition, the kind that settles when a line has been crossed and cannot be stepped back over. Ava remained seated, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting lightly over the envelope, her gaze no longer on the monitor but lowered slightly now, not out of avoidance, but as if the moment no longer required her attention, as if what needed to be seen had already been revealed. Officer Reeves stood still, his shoulders no longer squared in the same way, the rigid alignment of his posture softened by something less visible but more significant, and when he finally moved, it was small, a shift of weight, a subtle adjustment that seemed to search for balance where certainty had once been. The taller officer turned then, not quickly, not abruptly, but with a deliberate calm, his eyes settling on Reeves with a steadiness that did not accuse, did not confront, but did not look away either. And when he spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying no raised tone. "We are going to need to report this." And the words did not echo. They did not demand attention, but they carried weight, the kind that does not rely on volume to be heard. Reeves blinked once, slowly, his gaze dropping for a brief moment before lifting again, but not toward Ava, not toward the screen, instead somewhere in between, unfocused, as if the space itself had become difficult to hold, and his lips parted slightly, as though a response might come, but none did, not immediately, because there was nothing left that could reshape what had already been seen. The room remained still, the air unchanged, but the direction of everything inside it had shifted completely, the tension that had once been centered on Ava now dissolving, redistributing, settling into a different place entirely. Ava's fingers adjusted slightly over the envelope, not gripping it tighter, just repositioning it in her lap, and she looked up then, not at Reeves directly, but in his direction, her expression calm, composed, unchanged, and there was no triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction, just a quiet presence that did not seek acknowledgement, did not require apology, simply existed as it had from the beginning. The taller officer stepped back half a pace, his posture straightening, his role no longer passive, no longer observational, but aligned now with something larger than the moment itself, something that extended beyond the room, beyond the station, into a process that would continue long after this silence ended. Outside, a faint announcement echoed through the corridor, distant and distorted, reminding them all that time had not stopped, that the world beyond these walls continued without pause, and yet inside, the moment lingered, stretched, held in place by the quiet weight of what had just unfolded. Reeves finally turned his head slightly, his eyes landing briefly on the monitor, then shifting away almost immediately, as if the image there no longer belonged to him, as if it had separated itself from whatever control he had once held. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, not uncertain, but stripped of the authority it had carried at the start. "We will handle it," he said, though the words felt different now, less like a directive, more like an acknowledgement of something already beyond his reach. Ava rose slowly from her chair, not because she had been told to, not because the moment demanded it, but because something inside her recognized that this part of it was over, her movement quiet, deliberate, and she held the envelope at her side now, no longer pressed against her chest, her posture straight, her steps measured as she stood within the same space that had once held her under scrutiny, and yet felt entirely different now. The taller officer glanced at her briefly, then back to Reeves, and there was a pause, small but meaningful, before he spoke again, his tone unchanged. "She will need to be released." And the statement carried no hesitation, no uncertainty, just clarity, and in that clarity, the last fragments of what had been assumed began to fall away. Reeves did not respond immediately, his gaze lowering once more, and for the first time, the silence in the room did not feel like pressure, did not feel like judgment. It felt like consequence, quiet, steady, unavoidable, and as it settled fully into place, there was nothing left to hold it back, nothing left to reshape it. Only the truth, clear and present, standing where it had always been, waiting for the moment when it would finally be seen. Reeves did not look up when the words settled into the room, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might remain exactly where he was, suspended between what had been and what now had to follow, his hand resting against the edge of the desk, fingers lightly touching the surface as if grounding himself in something solid, while everything else shifted quietly out of place. The taller officer moved first, stepping away from the monitor with a calm, deliberate pace, his attention no longer divided, no longer observing, but focused, present, and aligned with what needed to happen next. And though his voice remained low when he spoke again, there was no hesitation in it. "We will notify internal affairs," and the statement carried a weight that extended beyond the room, beyond the station, into a process that neither of them could control once it began. Ava stood still near the chair, her posture relaxed but upright, her gaze steady, not following the exchange between the two officers, not searching their faces for reaction, but simply existing within the moment as it unfolded, her presence unchanged, as though the shift in power around her had not altered who she was, only revealed what had always been true. The faint hum of the lights continued overhead, steady, indifferent, casting the same cold brightness across the room as before, but the space felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the certainty that once filled it had dissolved, leaving behind something quieter, something more honest, something that did not need to be reinforced. Reeves finally exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to carry more weight than the words that followed. And when he spoke, his voice was controlled, but stripped of its earlier authority. "There is a process," he said, not looking directly at the taller officer, not fully meeting his gaze, as if the words were meant more for himself than for anyone else. And the taller officer nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because the process was already in motion, whether Reeves accepted it or not. Ava shifted her weight slightly, the envelope still held at her side now, her fingers resting along its edge, and for a brief moment, her eyes moved toward the door, the hallway beyond it, the world that continued outside of this room, and though she said nothing, the direction of her gaze carried meaning, not urgency, not impatience, but a quiet awareness of time, of what still waited for her beyond this moment. "You are free to go," the taller officer said then, turning his attention fully to her, his tone calm, respectful, and Ava nodded once, not quickly, not dramatically, just a small acknowledgement, and she took a step forward, then another, her movements measured, steady. As she moved toward the door without looking back, the handle turned softly in her hand, the hinge giving way with a faint sound as the door opened, and for a second, the noise from the hallway filtered in, distant voices, footsteps, the low echo of announcements, reminders that the world had not paused for what had just happened inside this room. Ava stepped through without hesitation, the light from the corridor shifting across her face for a brief moment before she moved fully into it, and the door closed behind her with a soft, final click that seemed louder than it should have been. Inside, the room remained still, the monitor still frozen on that single frame, the clipboard resting untouched on the desk, and Reeves stood where he had been, his posture no longer rigid, no longer anchored in certainty, but not collapsed either, simply present, facing the quiet consequence that had settled around him. The taller officer moved toward the desk, reaching for the clipboard, his movements precise, methodical. And as he began to review the notes written there, the sound of paper shifting filled the space again. But this time, it carried a different meaning, not documentation of assumption, but the beginning of correction. Reeves' eyes drifted once more toward the monitor, lingering there a fraction longer this time. And though he did not speak, something in his expression shifted again, not denial, not resistance, but something quieter, something heavier, like the slow realization of a line that had been crossed without the possibility of stepping back. Outside, Ava walked down the hallway, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, the envelope still in her hand, and as she moved further away from the room, the air seemed to open around her, the tension that had once pressed against her now gone, replaced by something lighter, something unspoken but present, and she did not look back, not because she was trying to forget, but because there was nothing left behind that needed her attention. The fluorescent lights above cast a soft reflection along the floor as she walked, each step quiet, each movement deliberate, and in that quiet, with the world slowly returning to its rhythm around her, she carried something with her that could not be taken, something that had not been shaken by accusation or doubt, something steady and clear, and behind her, within the walls of that room, the silence remained, no longer holding her in place, but holding something else, entirely, something that had only just begun to unravel. The hallway outside felt wider than before, as if the space itself had expanded the moment Ava stepped into it, and the sound of her footsteps returned to her slowly, each one soft against the polished floor, blending with the distant rhythm of the station waking back into motion, announcements echoing overhead in a voice that sounded too calm to belong to anything urgent, too steady to reflect what had just taken place behind a closed door. She did not rush, did not look at the clock mounted above the corridor, though she knew the time was slipping forward, knew the exam she had prepared for was now closer than ever, her grip on the envelope tightening slightly, not from fear, but from awareness, from the quiet understanding that what mattered had not been taken from her, had not been altered, Even if the path to it had shifted, a man in a gray jacket passed by her without slowing, his shoulder brushing the air near her arm, his attention fixed on his phone, unaware of the moment. She had just walked through, and a woman stood near a pillar adjusting her bag, her eyes flicking up briefly before returning to whatever occupied her thoughts, the world continuing in fragments, unaware, unchanged, and yet Ava felt the difference in herself, not something visible, not something that could be named easily, but something steadier, something settled. She reached the main terminal again, the open space unfolding in front of her with its usual noise, the rolling of suitcases, the murmur of conversations, the distant hiss of a bus pulling into its lane. And for a moment, she paused, not because she needed to, but because her body recognized the transition, the shift from silence to movement, from contained tension to open space. Her eyes moved across the room, not searching, just observing, taking in the same place that had felt so different earlier, the same lights, the same floor, the same steady flow of people moving through their own timelines. And then she saw it, her bag, still lying near the edge of the corridor where it had been left, the contents no longer scattered. Someone had placed them back inside, not perfectly, not with her careful alignment, but with enough intention to restore a sense of order, and the small plastic bundle was gone. Removed, taken into whatever process now followed behind closed doors. Ava walked toward it without hesitation, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, and as she reached down to lift it, the fabric felt familiar in her hands, the worn strap settling back over her shoulder as if nothing had interrupted its place there, as if the moment had not tried to redefine it, and she adjusted it once, lightly, before straightening again. For a second, her gaze lifted, not toward the officers, not toward the hallway she had come from, but toward the far end of the terminal where sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting a softer light across the floor, warmer than the fluorescent glow she had just left behind, and she moved toward it, not quickly, not urgently, just with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through everything. Behind her, far down the corridor, the door to the room remained closed, and inside, the silence had taken on a different shape, no longer heavy with accusation, but with something quieter, something more difficult to move past. And though Ava could not hear it, could not see it, its presence lingered, like an echo that refused to fade. She reached into her bag briefly, checking the envelope again, her fingers brushing the edge as if confirming its reality, its place in the world beyond what had happened, and then she let her hand fall back to her side, her pace continuing, her direction unchanged. The announcement overhead shifted, calling out departures and arrivals, names of cities that stretched beyond the walls of the station, and Ava listened without really hearing, her focus not on where others were going, but on where she still could go, where she still intended to be, because the path ahead had not disappeared, it had only been delayed. She passed through the flow of people, without resistance, her presence neither drawing attention nor avoiding it, simply moving forward. And as she stepped into the brighter light near the exit, the air felt different, less contained, carrying a faint hint of the outside, of movement beyond schedules and terminals, and she did not pause there, did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that needed her return, nothing that could change what had already been revealed. Somewhere, beyond her sight, beyond her reach, a process had begun, one that would unfold in its own time, with its own weight. But for Ava, the moment had already shifted into something else, something quieter, something clearer, and as she walked forward, the sound of her footsteps blending into the rhythm of everything around her, there was no trace of hesitation in her stride, no shadow left from what had tried to hold her in place, only a steady movement toward what still lay ahead, unchanged and waiting. The light outside the station doors carried a different weight than the artificial glow behind her, softer, warmer, spreading across the pavement in long, quiet lines that stretched toward the street, and Ava stepped into it without slowing. The shift almost immediate as the air changed against her skin, cooler, moving, alive in a way the interior had not been. The sound of traffic drifted in, distant engines, the low hum of tires against asphalt, a bus door hissing open somewhere to her left. And she adjusted the strap of her bag once more, settling it firmly against her shoulder as she moved toward the curb where the next connection waited. Her reflection flickered briefly in the glass of the station entrance behind her, a faint image layered over the movement inside. People passing, lights glowing. A place already continuing without her, and she did not turn to look at it directly. Did not pause to confirm what she had left behind, because the moment had already closed in its own way, quietly, without ceremony. Across the street, a digital clock mounted above a transit sign blinked the time in bright red numbers, each second shifting forward with mechanical precision, and Ava's eyes lifted to it just long enough to register the narrowing margin, the space between now and where she needed to be, and then she lowered her gaze again, her pace steady but slightly quicker now, not rushed, not frantic, just purposeful. A bus idled nearby, its doors open, a small line forming as passengers stepped up one by one, their movements ordinary, unremarkable, and Ava joined the edge of it, her presence blending into the rhythm of everyone else, no longer separated by scrutiny, no longer held in place by assumption, just another person moving forward. Inside the station, far beyond her sight, the room she had left remained unchanged in its structure but altered in everything that mattered. The monitor still paused on that single frame, the image frozen but heavy with meaning, and the taller officer stood near the desk, his posture straight, his expression composed, though his attention remained fixed on the process now unfolding, the call already placed, the report already initiated, each step moving forward with a quiet inevitability. Officer Reeves sat down slowly, the chair beneath him making a faint sound as it shifted under his weight, and he leaned forward just slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped together as he looked down, not at anything specific, just at the space between his feet, and for the first time, the stillness around him was not something he controlled, not something he directed, but something he inhabited. The fluorescent lights above cast their steady brightness across the room, revealing everything without shadow, and the clipboard remained on the desk, its pages filled with words that no longer held the same meaning they had minutes before, the ink unchanged but the context entirely different. The taller officer moved toward the door, pausing for a moment before stepping out into the hallway, his hand resting briefly on the frame as he looked back once, not at Reeves directly, but at the room itself, as if marking the place where something had shifted, something that would not be undone, and then he continued on, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Reeves alone with the quiet that had settled fully now. Outside, Ava stepped onto the bus, her hand brushing the metal rail as she climbed the short set of steps, the driver nodding briefly without asking questions, without hesitation, and she moved down the aisle, finding a seat near the window, placing her bag beside her as she sat, the envelope resting lightly on top of it. The bus door closed with a soft mechanical sound, sealing the space, and as it pulled away from the curb, the station began to recede behind her, the glass facade reflecting the movement of the street, the figures inside growing smaller, less distinct. Ava looked out the window, her gaze not fixed on any one point, just following the motion of the world passing by, the buildings, the sidewalks, the people moving through their own mornings, and she took a slow breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to feel the air fill her lungs and settle again. Inside the station, the process continued without pause, steps taken, reports filed, the quiet machinery of accountability beginning its work, not loudly, not visibly to the outside world, but steadily, with a weight that did not require attention to exist. And as the bus moved further down the road, carrying Ava toward what still lay ahead, the distance between her and that room grew, not just in miles, but in meaning, in the quiet understanding that what had happened there did not define her path, did not alter what she carried with her, and she did not look back, not because she was avoiding it, but because she did not need to, because the truth had already done what it needed to do, and now, all that remained was forward. The bus moved steadily through the city, its motion smooth and rhythmic, the quiet hum of the engine blending with the soft rattle of windows against their frames, and Ava sat by the glass, her reflection faint against the passing streets, layered over buildings and traffic lights and pedestrians crossing intersections without knowing her story, without needing to, because the world did not pause to understand every moment that passed through it. It simply carried on, and she moved with it now. Not behind it, not held back, but aligned again with its forward motion. Her fingers rested lightly on the envelope beside her, no longer gripping it, no longer checking it, just letting it be, as if she trusted it to remain, as if she trusted herself to arrive where she needed to go regardless of what had tried to interrupt her path. The sunlight shifted as the bus turned a corner, casting a warmer glow across her hands, softening the edges of everything in the seat beside her, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, not in escape, but in a quiet reset, a small pause that belonged entirely to her, separate from the noise, separate from the memory of fluorescent lights and controlled voices and frozen screens. Inside the station, far behind her now, the room no longer held silence in the same way, because it had begun to fill with something else, the quiet movement of consequence unfolding step by step, reports being read, calls being answered, procedures shifting from assumption to review, and Officer Reeves remained seated where he had been. Though time had passed, though the light had not changed, his posture still forward, his hands still loosely clasped, but his gaze now lifted slightly, not fully, not confidently, just enough to no longer look down, as if the act of facing what had happened required its own kind of effort. The monitor had been turned off, the frozen image no longer visible, but its presence remained in the room, not as a picture, but as something remembered, something that did not fade simply because the screen had gone dark and the clipboard had been taken from the desk, its contents now part of something larger, something that would continue beyond the walls, beyond the day. Outside, the bus slowed as it approached another stop, the gentle hiss of brakes filling the space, and Ava opened her eyes again, her gaze steady as she looked ahead, not scanning, not searching, just present. And when the doors opened, a few passengers stepped off, others stepped on, the exchange seamless, ordinary, life continuing in small, unremarkable cycles. She reached into her bag once more, not to check the envelope, but to pull out a pen, rolling it lightly between her fingers as if grounding herself in something simple, something familiar, and she glanced at the schedule posted above the driver, confirming what she already knew, that she still had time, that the path ahead had not closed, only shifted slightly, and she adjusted her posture in the seat, sitting a little straighter, not out of tension, but readiness. The city passed by in steady frames outside the window, storefronts opening, people walking with coffee cups in hand, a man unlocking a bicycle from a rack, a child waiting at a corner with a backpack too large for their shoulders, all of it moving forward without pause, without hesitation, and Ava's reflection remained therein. The glass, quiet, steady, unchanged. Back in the station, the hallway outside the room filled briefly with footsteps as someone passed by, then emptied again, the space returning to its neutral state, as if it had never held the weight it once did, and yet the shift remained, embedded in the process now underway, in the quiet acknowledgement that something had been seen, something had been corrected. The bus turned again, the sunlight shifting across Ava's face, and she looked out at the road. Ahead, her expression calm, her breathing even, and there was no trace of what had tried to define her earlier, no shadow left from the accusation that had attempted to